Hello everyone, and welcome to the first session of the course. It's really great to have you all with us. I'm hoping that you can hear me right now and that also you can see our logo on your screen there. What I'm going to do before we go any further is I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see the slides, and then we will begin. So just bear with me for 1 second while I do that. Okay, I'm hoping that you can all now see the first slide of the presentation. So what I'm going to do is tell you very briefly what the structure of this session is going to be. I'm going to begin by giving a very quick introduction, firstly to the whole course, which starts today and goes on, as you know, for almost a whole year until November later this year. Then I'm going to give you a little bit of a rundown of the different ways that you can interact with the materials that we're producing, different ways that you can take part in the course, ways you can watch these sessions live or catch up with them, different ways that it's possible for you to interact with me as the person teaching the course, and for you to all interact with each other as the people taking part. So I'm going to give you just a quick intro to how some of those practicalities are going to work. Then we're going to get into the first session itself, and that will take us about 45 minutes. And we're going to be looking at some case studies from across the world and exploring the experiences of people who have moved as a result of climate change impacts, and looking at what those experiences, what those testimonies from those people can actually tell us in general about how climate change is altering patterns of migration and displacement across the planet. I should say that if you want to tweet at us as we're going along, that would be great. So the Twitter handle is @Climig, and if you want to use a hashtag, you can use ClimigCourse. So if you want to say that you're taking part in the live stream, or even if you want to pose a question or share a link, please do so using that Twitter handle and hashtag. So firstly, I want to talk you through some of the ways that you can take part in these sessions. And really what I'm saying is if you do as many of these things as possible, you will be getting the most that you can out of the course as a whole. So this is just a very quick introduction to basically how to participate, how to take part in the course. The first thing is that you can join the live sessions. So if you're listening to this now, then you have already done that. You are joining a live session. And during those sessions, you can ask questions in the chat function, the chat feature on YouTube, which you should see to the right of the video. So in that chat box, you can ask questions, and I will take a look at those at the end and try and answer them as best I can. I'm here with my colleague Leanne, who you will see on the chat window as well. So she'll be responding to some of your questions as we go along if you're having technical issues. She'll also be sort of taking note of those questions as they come in so that I can answer them at the end. You should also feel free as we go along to interact with each other using that chat feature. If you see someone has posted a question and you want to comment on that, then please do go ahead. That is a space for you as the course participants to interact with each other, as well as a place for you to ask questions of me that I will get to at the end. You can, of course, also catch up on these videos, on these sessions, if you don't come to the live event. Now, that's important for two reasons. Not everyone can make every session. We've got people on the course from across the world. So I've got people on the course for whom it is now 2 o'clock in the morning. So they will be catching up on these sessions in their own time. Having said that, if you also want to go back and rewatch any of it, you can. And the simplest way to do that is the recording of the session will be at the same URL that you are visiting now, right? When this session, the live session ends, the recording of the video is going to be in exactly the same place. If you want to come back and watch it, you can either save this link that you're on now, or you can go back and find the email where I've alerted you to the time and the date for the live session. You can just click that and you can come and rewatch it whenever you want. So if there's something you want to revisit, something you want to go over again, then you can use the catch up to do that. Now, discussion and debate is taking place mainly on Facebook for the simple reason that it's the platform that most people have access to. A lot of people already have a Facebook account. There is a private closed group, especially for this course, where that discussion is going to take place. A lot of you I know have already joined the group, and that's great. If you're on this live session and you want to take part in discussion with your peers on the course, please do find the email. The link to the group is in the email. Join that group, and you can then do a number of different things on there. Feel free to introduce yourself on the group, say who you are, why you joined the course, your motivation for doing it. Also, if you want to pose questions, if you want to ask me a question, if there's a topic of discussion you want to kind of bring to that group, then feel free to open that up. I will also be going on that group and answering some of your questions and kind of engaging in some of the debate that's going on. I am going to be setting you some tasks to do at the end of this session. And I should say that these are completely voluntary. There is no obligation to do them. They are part of your own learning, and if you wish to do them, then you're doing them entirely for your own interest. Unfortunately, we won't have time to mark them or grade them or assess them in any way, because we do actually have nearly 1,000 of you on the course. So unfortunately, it would be almost impossible for me to kind of read the any of the results of the tasks that you do. But what I should say is that these tasks are really going to be set up for you to deepen your own learning. They're a way of you pursuing your own interest in a slightly more structured way and engaging with some of what we've talked about in the live sessions in your own time to delve further into some of these issues with a little bit of guidance from me. And the way I'm going to set those tasks is that at the end of this session, when we're done with the live session, you'll receive an email in the next couple of days, which will have various bits of useful information, like a reminder of where you can go and review and watch the session again if you wish to. And it will also have a guide to completing the first tasks that are part of the first lecture. So keep an eye on your inbox for that coming in over the next few days. The final thing is about feedback and monitoring. And this is really, really important, okay? Because one of the things that we've been really surprised about, and it's been absolutely fantastic, but we have got nearly 1,000 of you taking part in this. And we don't at the moment know much about who you are, your level of knowledge, what you already understand and don't understand, where you're at in your learning about the links between climate change and migration. So I've already sent around one survey, which has been really useful. So thanks to everyone who has filled that in. But over the course of the year, I'm going to be surveying you fairly regularly. And this is really to help me gauge whether I am getting these sessions right. It's really important for me to know whether I'm going too fast, whether I'm covering material that you already know, whether the lectures, whether the live sessions are making sense to you. So when you do get an email saying, can we have your feedback quickly, please do fill it in, because that is how, that is what guides the development of the next lecture and makes sure that it, as best it can, kind of meets the learning needs of everyone who's taking part in this course. So please do fill in the feedback and monitoring surveys when they come around. That really helps us pitch this course right for all of you. So I'm going to really quickly now say a little bit about this session and what we're going to do in it. So we're going to jump straight in to looking at some real life examples, looking at some case studies of people who have migrated. We're going to be going to 4 different places across the planet and looking at 4 different examples of people who, for one climate-linked reason or another, have left their home and moved to somewhere else. We're going to be looking at actual testimonies from these people and examining their words quite closely, examining what they have said about their own experience of migration, and using their experience and using their words to help us understand more broadly what these connections are, how these connections between our changing climate and the movement of people across the planet work. So that's, in a way, that involves us diving straight in. But what I'm going to do as well as we go through these testimonies, as we look at these people's experiences, is use it as a way of signposting to things that we're going to be looking at in much more depth throughout the year. So for each of these experiences, for each of these testimonies from an individual migrant, I will also be pointing you to where in the course we will be exploring some of these issues in more depth. So this is a way of diving straight in. It's a way of doing something, quite real and quite tangible in our first session. It also acts as a guide to the rest of the year, so that by the end of this live session, you will have a bit of an idea, a bit of a map of what we are going to be examining and when throughout the rest of the course. So the 4 places that we're going to be looking at are Mexico, Somalia, Philippines, and Kiribati. And we're going to be hearing I'm going to be showing you short quotes, short testimonies from each of these places, and then we're going to be examining what those testimonies, what those actual words, the experiences of those migrants tell us about this issue. So the first one that we're going to look at is from Mexico, and this is the testimony that I'm about to show you is one which I think is particularly important in our understanding of drought, which is a key climate change impact, and also how, in some cases, that drought can drive cross-border migration. So let's dive straight into this. I'm going to start by just reading the testimony to you. Hopefully you can see it there on the screen yourself as well. And then what we're going to do is basically kind of analyze these words, look at this experience, look at what this person is saying about their own migration, and begin to use that to pick apart this issue more broadly. So here we go. Times have changed. The rain is coming later now, so we produce less. The only solution is to go away, at least for a while. Each year I'm working for 3 to 5 months in Wyoming, and that is my main source of income now. So what can we begin to understand about this testimony, about this person, about this person's experience? The first thing that I want to point you to is this piece of text that I've highlighted. The rain is coming later now, so we produce less. And I think what it's really important to say here is that one of the key ways in which the impacts of climate change are set to alter patterns of migration is via rainfall variability, right? Via changes in rainfall patterns and an increase in drought. And what that does very often is for people who work in agricultural areas that are very dependent on having regular rainfall, having predictable rainfall, this begins to alter what they can produce. And usually it results in people being able to produce less. So this is one of the key, most important ways in which climate change impacts are connected to human migration. In fact, in my view, it's probably the key way in which climate change begins to alter patterns of migration, is via changes in rainfall patterns. Now, I've sort of said something about that very briefly, but we're going to be looking at that and other drivers of migration that are linked to climate change in much more depth in sessions 2 and 3. So in our live stream sessions in March and April, we're really going to be delving into this and the other ways, the other kinds of impacts that drive human movement that are linked to climate change. Another key thing that I want to point you to here, which for me is one of the sort of unexpected patterns of climate-linked migration. So this person is saying that each year they're moving for 3 to 5 months, right? They're migrating and then they're returning. They're crossing the border from Mexico into the US. They're working in Wyoming for less than half of the year and then coming back. Now, I think this is interesting because this in many ways sort of goes against what we often hear about climate-linked migration. I think if you look at news stories about the relationship between climate change and migration, the idea that you would get from the headlines is very much that it's going to produce permanent movement, that people will leave an area forever and never return and will live permanently in their new location. Now, in some cases, that's certainly true, and in the future, it may be true as well. But one of the curious things that we're seeing at the moment is the fact that people move temporarily. They move with agricultural seasons, they move as drought gets worse, but then return as drought alleviates. So what we have right now, rather than being large numbers of people moving permanently, is actually large numbers of people who are affected by climate change impacts moving temporarily backwards and forwards, moving in a circular fashion, often with the agricultural seasons. Again, we'll be looking in more depth at that in sessions 2 and 3 in March and April. One of the most interesting things about this testimony for me as well is the fact that this person has crossed an international border. Now, in many ways, this testimony therefore is unusual. If we look in general at climate-linked migration across the world as it is happening now, the vast majority of it is people moving within their own country. It's people not crossing international borders. So what to me stands out about this particular experience, the experience of this particular person, is that they have crossed an international border. And that means that they are perhaps more unusual when it comes to people who move, people who migrate as a result of climate change impacts. Again, we'll be looking in more depth at why that is, and we'll be looking at how cross-border and internal migration are different, how people's experiences of those two kinds of migration are different, again, in sessions 2 and 3, so next month and the month after. One of the other key issues relating to cross-border movement is this wider issue of border security and who gets to cross international borders and who does not. So both in Europe and in America, this has become a key topic in politics and the media. In Europe, the media focus has really been on people crossing the Mediterranean. In the United States, it's been people crossing the southern border into the US. And this has raised huge issues about border security and has also led to sort of speculation about what kind of border environments might be created as climate change begins to take hold and more people begin to move. What we're going to be doing in session 5 is looking at the way these debates around border security and people crossing borders interact with climate change. The question that we're going to be asking in that session, though, is for whom is this security being created? When we talk about the links between climate change, migration, and security, whose security is it that we are talking about? So in that session, we'll be looking at the ways in which climate change may drive movement across borders and the ways that governments may choose to respond to that using a kind of securitized toolkit, using various kinds of security measures like borders, militarizing borders, and the other things that we often see governments doing to try and prevent migration. So that's going to be one of the first sort of more controversial issues that we look at. The first few sessions are really going to be us sketching out how climate change and migration are linked. They're going to be looking at what drives climate change and then how that creates different forms of migration and displacement. But in session 5, we'll really begin to start looking at some of the issues where this becomes controversial, where it becomes political. Another point of controversy as well is our understanding of the relationship between climate change, migration, and labor markets. So if we look at the very end of this person's testimony, we look at what they're saying right here in the final sentence. What becomes clear from this is that it's not the direct impact of the drought, of the changing rainfall that has caused has caused this person to move. What's happening here is they are experiencing the impacts of climate change via the labor market, right? Climate change has made it harder for them to earn a living where they were in Mexico, and various forces have meant that it is easier for them to make a livelihood, to find an income by crossing the border and working in the United States. Now, an awful lot of the migration that is linked to climate change is experienced by people in this way, is often experienced by people rather than being kind of directly hit by the climate change impact. They're moving in order to try and find work. And this raises big questions about the relationship between labor markets and climate-linked migration. To what extent, for example, should we be looking to labor markets to help people cope with climate change? And that's the sort of next big controversial topic that we're going to be looking at in the course. So in session 4, we're going to be looking at the links between climate migration and neoliberalism. We'll be looking at the ways in which our economy, kind of our modern global economy, is and is not helping with climate-linked migration. So that's session 4. We'll be looking at more of those kind of connections. So I hope what I've done there is give you a very brief kind of insight into the experience of someone who has moved in this way, and also giving you some pointers to various things that we're going to be discussing throughout the course. The next testimony, the next experience that I want to look at is from someone who has moved from Somalia, and they were interviewed. They said they relayed their experience of this in a refugee camp. And what I want to do is basically a kind of very similar thing, is to look at this person's experience, look at the testimony, look at the words that they have used to describe what happened to them, and use those to then explore some of the connections between climate change and migration. So here's the testimony. And since there was the war, we did not receive any support from the government. Therefore, there are combined factors that made us suffer: droughts and war. If war did not exist, then we might have been able to stay, but now the land is looted and there is no way for us to claim it. So what I'd like to do now is something similar. Let's take various kind of pieces of this testimony, various bits of this person's experience, and try and understand what this can tell us more broadly about climate-linked migration. Firstly, I think one of the really kind of obvious things that this person's testimony tells us is that someone's pre-existing vulnerability to climate change impacts has a huge influence on whether or not they end up moving. So in many ways, this person has moved, of course, because of the war, of course, because of the drought. But what's clear here is that one of the reasons that they moved rather than stayed put was because of a lack of support from the government, right? They were not being supported by their government in a way that enabled them to stay in their homes. Now, this raises some really big questions when it comes to climate-linked migration, because of course we can point to all kinds of climate change impacts and say, well, a certain group of people were forced to move by this particular climate change impact. But then if we look at different places across the world where very similar climate change impacts take place, we often find that some people are forced to move while other people are not. Some people are supported by their government during those episodes of impact. Some people are supported by their governments during periods of drought or when disasters strike. And that makes them more resilient to those impacts and enables them to stay put, or if they do have to move, to return later. Whereas other people do not receive the similar kind of support. And that can be direct support during the actual disaster itself, or it can be support from their government in more general ways. So some governments have been in a position to invest heavily in the kinds of infrastructure that keep people safe from things like drought, hurricanes, and typhoons, whereas other governments have not. And what we see is that it is people who haven't benefited from those kinds of government intervention, from that kind of infrastructure and from that kind of assistance that very often end up moving as a result of climate change impacts. So while it's important, of course, to point at the particular kinds of disasters that are causing people to move, and it's important, of course, to connect those disasters to rising global temperatures, we also have to consider the fact that whether or not someone moves actually has a huge amount to do with the wealth and development and the infrastructure of their country. And that's what we're going to be looking at in session 5. We'll be examining the different ways that inequality causes different patterns of migration and displacement that are linked to climate change. Why is it? The question of this session really will be, why is it that some people end up moving while other people can stay put? The next thing that I think is particularly kind of important about this testimony is if we look at the words that this person has, this refugee has said, they're saying that it wasn't just the drought that made them move, right? It wasn't purely moving away from a drought hit area in order to find other work. They're saying that actually it was two things that made them move. It was a combination of drought and war. And this is another very common facet of migration and displacement that are linked to climate change. Very often we'll find that when people are exposed to climate change impacts, it's often the case that they don't move. During droughts, people sometimes stay put. During other kinds of climate-linked events and hazards, people often stay put if they can. But it is then the combination of that climate change impact and something else, like a war or extreme poverty, that causes them to move. And you often need a number of different factors before you start seeing people migrating or people being displaced by climate change impacts. So what we're going to be looking at right at the end of the course in sessions 9 and 10 is some of the really complicated ways in which events like wars interact with climate change impacts and create what we call complex emergencies. So towards the end of the course, when we've built what I hope is quite a solid understanding of all of these different drivers of migration and displacement, when we've really kind of got to grips with these issues in quite a lot of depth, right at the end, we're going to try and deploy that knowledge to look at some really, really complicated situations. Some complicated situations in which a number of different factors are at play, and use the knowledge that we've gained over the course to try and understand those. The next example I want to look at is from the Philippines in the immediate aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan. So let's take a quick look at this testimony, at this person's experience. We were trapped in the house for 2 days until someone came and rescued us in a boat, and we were taken to a local gymnasium, which was being used as an evacuation center. It proved impossible to live there as well, so we left after another week and spent the next 5 weeks staying with relatives. So again, what I'd like to do is just look briefly at this person's experience and try and pull out from their testimony some insights into the ways that climate change is driving patterns of migration and displacement and what those can tell us. So I think the first thing that it's important to note about this testimony, in contrast to the first one that we looked at when we were talking about Mexico, is that this was a Typhoon Haiyan, and typhoons and hurricanes are sudden events, okay? So a drought might unfold over a number of months or even years, whereas a typhoon or a hurricane is a disaster that arrives in with very little warning in a number of hours or a number of days. And the suddenness of these kinds of events creates very different kinds of human movement. So in our first testimony from Mexico, what we could see is someone moving backwards and forwards with perhaps some decision-making power, some agency in choosing when they left and where they went to. Of course, their choices were still very, very constrained by the fact that they were moving as a way of coping with a drought. But what we can see here in this testimony from the Philippines is actually something quite different. Here, in cases like this, moving is simply a case of ensuring someone's immediate survival, or in this case, in fact, being rescued and being evacuated. So this is really a very different kind of pattern. And what we'll do again in sessions 2 and 3 is look at these really important distinctions. The first one is the difference between rapid or rapid and slow onset disasters. So disasters that come very quickly, disasters that unfold over months, and the different kinds of human movement that they create. And the key distinction there is going to be between displacement, where people are really forced to move and have almost no choice about it, and patterns of movement that are more like migration, where people have some choice and some agency in their migratory decision. And what we'll be exploring in sessions 2 and 3 is the ways that these different kinds of disasters create different kinds of migration and give people different levels of choice about what they do, where they go, and who they go with. Another really important thing that I think this testimony shows us about climate-linked migration, climate-linked displacement, is that it is very often short distance. It is very often people moving not particularly far. So if we look at what they're saying here, that when they're evacuated, they were taken to a local gymnasium, okay? And the likelihood is that that is a small number of kilometers from their home. When we look at some of the statistics on displacement linked to climate change hazards, what we're finding is that a lot of people actually are not moving very far. People are moving a short distance and then returning. People are moving to local evacuation centers. They're moving to relatives that live nearby. They're basically not going far from their home. And this raises some really big questions, because at the moment we can say, well, that is a perfectly understandable response to these kinds of disasters. And it's, of course, right that people should return home when it's safe. They should return to where they've, the place that they were displaced from, if they wish, be part of reconstruction efforts, try to get their lives, their livelihoods, their communities back on track and recover from the disaster that they've experienced. However, climate change raises some big questions about this kind of short distance displacement. While it's a very common pattern at the moment, we can ask, will this kind of short distance movement and then return be possible in the future as the kinds of disasters that climate change produces begin to become more powerful and more frequent? Final example that I want to look at is from Kiribati, from an island state in the Pacific. And in many ways, these island countries, these low-lying island countries, have become very iconic of the whole debate about climate change and migration. And what I want to do is just explore with you a testimony, an experience of someone who is facing displacement from those islands, and see what their experience, their testimony reveals about their situation in particular. So here's the testimony. The majority of Kiribati are people, citizens of the island state of Kiribati. The majority of Kiribati have no wish to live in another country, but mounting evidence suggests that we may soon have little choice. Therefore, migration may become the key part of how we are forced to adapt. But we have no significant or sympathetic migration relationship or policy with another country. So let's see what this testimony can show us about some of the key issues in this field. The first one, I think, is this part of the quote. Migration may become a key part of how we are forced to adapt. Now, this is referencing an issue within climate-linked migration that has become quite controversial. And this is the issue of migration as a form of climate change adaptation. This is the idea that an amount of migration, amount of human movement linked to climate change is going to be inevitable. And in the face of that, perhaps it is sensible that rather than always being seen as a disaster or a tragedy or a problem, that migration becomes an empowering way for some people to adapt to the worst impacts of climate change. Now, this has been controversial because, of course, many people have no wish to leave their homes at all. And that's what's being expressed here as part of this testimony. The phrase forced to adapt shows to me that this person is saying, well, this form of adaptation is far from ideal. It may not be empowering. It may not be what many people want for their lives. It may not feel like adaptation to them. So one of the things that we're going to do in this course is explore some of the controversies around that and other policy issues. Migration as adaptation to climate change has become a key policy response, if you like. It's become a way in which some governments and international agencies are beginning to think about migration linked to climate change. It's developing into an area of policy that is gaining support from some governments as well. And it has many advantages, in my view. But what we're going to do is try and look at it critically, rather than sort of just accepting it at face value. We're going to look at it and try and understand how people who are in the process of moving at the moment, how people who are facing migration, what can we understand from their experiences, from their testimonies, from the things that they've said about how they feel about this and various other policy responses. So what we'll look at in sessions 7 and 8 is not just migration as adaptation, but a whole range of policy responses, a whole range of different ways in which international agencies, governments, and NGOs are beginning to think about how they react to climate-linked migration. We'll examine the proposals that they're putting forward, the ways that they are suggesting that as a society, as a planet, we deal with this issue. We'll look at several of them in turn, and we will also try to take quite a critical approach to many of them. Our purpose will be to explore them and examine their pros and their cons, their benefits and their drawbacks. Think about whether we think they are fair, think about who they benefit and who they cost, and think about whether they are viable, whether they would be accepted by electorates, whether they would be accepted by governments, whether they would be accepted by people who may be moving, whether they benefit the people who are most in need or whether they don't. So during sessions 7 and 8, we'll be looking at many of those proposals and examining them critically. Similarly, this part of the testimony, I think, raises another really key issue, and this is the issue of the legal status of people who move as a result of climate change impacts. So for many years, this has been really the key debate in this field. The question of when someone crosses an international border, when they move from one country to another, what is their legal status? What rights do they have? What responsibility does the government of the country in which they have moved into have towards them? And this question of the rights and legal status of people who move as a result of climate change impacts is not just about people crossing international borders. There's also a key issue around the rights of people who have been displaced within their own country. What kind of responsibilities does their government have towards them? What kind of rights do they have to return, or how are those rights protected? So during our sessions on policy, we will also be looking in some depth at this question of legal status, of people's rights under international or national law. So I hope what I've done there is two things. Firstly, just give you very quickly some insight into the experiences of people who move as a result of climate change impacts. Show you the kinds of things that people say about their own lives and their own experiences, so that rather than beginning our exploration by trying to understand the data or the figures or the academic research, I hope what I've done there is dive into this issue by understanding the experiences of people who are actually moving, because that's going to be a key part of this course, is actually looking at what people say about their own migration and their own displacement. I hope also what I've done there is giving you a bit of a sketch of what we're going to cover over the course and when. So I'm sure that this session in many ways has raised perhaps more questions than it's answered, but that in many ways was my intention. What I wanted to do here was show you what a big, wide, broad, complicated topic this is, but then also show you that we will be delving into a lot of these sort of different facets of it, different niches, sort of different, more specific areas throughout the course over the next year. So what I'd like to do now is just try and address some of your questions that have come through on chat while we've been doing the session. And what I'm going to do is ask Lian, who is sat here with me, just to not read out some of the questions, but just to sort of make a quick summary of some of the broad topics that people have been asking about. And I will do my best to answer those now. If you've got questions that sort of you feel haven't been answered by the end of the session, then you've got two options. The first one is you can email me, and I will do my best to answer your question. If it's a question that is more something that you would like to discuss with your with the other course participants and have some input from me as well, then I would encourage you, rather than emailing me and doing that just the two of us, please do post it on the Facebook group, and I will answer it there, and that will mean that other people can see your question and my answer as well, and that will be a benefit to everyone. So Lian, if you can just tell me some of the things that people have been asking.
Yes. Hello, everybody. So thank you very much for all the questions that you've been asking. There's a variety, Alex, of questions that people have been asking about. Some people have been asking about specific countries. Some people have been asking about specific types of research that might be available, and some of the questions you've talked about. And maybe we can kick off with one of the first questions, which was, what is the definition of a climate refugee?
Okay.
And what is the criteria that needs to be met to be considered a climate refugee?
Okay. So this is a really important question, and I'm really glad that we are examining that right in the first session. So I'll give you a bit of an answer now, but we will also be examining that question a lot more in session 7 when we look at legal status. So this question that you pitched, what's the definition of a climate refugee? What's the criteria for meeting it? Is really one about at what point does someone who has moved as a result of a climate change impact get a particular kind of legal status? At what point do they get that? Now, the very difficult answer to that question is really that they don't, okay? Under international law, there is no official legal definition of a, quote, climate refugee. That is simply it's an empty term, if you like. It's not a phrase that really exists in international law in the same way that the definition of a conventional refugee does. So our understanding of legally who counts as a refugee, conventional refugee, and who does not, is defined by the Refugee Convention, right? It's a legal document. It's been adopted by most of the countries of the world, and it's the kind of guiding document that most countries use to create their own domestic law around refugees and the status of refugees within their own country. Now, there is no mention of climate change in that document anywhere. So that raises the question, well, in that case, who does and who doesn't count as a climate refugee? What would be, if it doesn't exist at the moment, what would be an ideal way of creating that status? And that raises, I'm afraid, another really, really complicated question, again, that we'll be looking at further in the course, is when people do move, when people do migrate, or when they do become displaced by the impacts of climate change, what would be the best way of protecting their rights? What would be the best way of protecting that they can't, making sure that they can't be returned or sent back to somewhere dangerous, making sure that when they are in their new country or their new location, that they have access to healthcare and education, that they're not exploited, that they're not abused in any way, that they're not discriminated against. So I think that the problem is that at the moment, that is an area of international law which doesn't have enough in it, if you like. That's sort of an unanswered question. Those people at the moment fall into a kind of legal limbo where their legal status and their rights are not clearly defined by international law. So in summary to your question, how do we, how do we define such people? At the moment, I'm afraid the answer is, well, at the moment, it's not well defined at all, and that's a really big problem.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Okay. There was also a question around, is there any kind of data that looks at the differences for people who might have, a lower level of income or a higher level of income, and how does that impact who is able to move and who can't?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a really interesting question, and there are a couple of ways of approaching that. So we can look at individual people's income, and we can also look at the wealth of countries. Now, when it comes to the wealth of a country, really what we can see from the data is that it is the vast majority of people who are displaced by disasters, including disasters that have some kind of connection to climate change. So upwards of 95% of those people are from the world's poorer countries, right? So what we're really seeing is that the wealth of a country has a huge determining force on whether people in that country experience displacement as a result of climate-linked disasters, right? So basically, better off countries, richer countries have the infrastructure and the resources such that when they face those kinds of disasters, fewer people are forced from their homes. Poorer countries, which don't have the resources to put into infrastructure protection, don't have the resources to put into helping people cope in the immediate aftermath of disasters, see much higher levels of displacement. There is also some data on kind of individually who ends up moving and who does not. And I think one of the key things to say at this point is that climate-linked migration is not one kind of human movement. It's not one thing. And I think what you would probably find if you delved into that data is that different kinds of climate-linked hazards, different kinds of climate change events are going to force people to move at different points across the income spectrum. So some events force people to move regardless of how much they earn, but then there's also a question of people who perhaps have higher incomes can afford to live in places that are less exposed to those kinds of disasters. Issues like hazards like drought, for example, will force people to move if they don't have savings that they can use to tide themselves over during their fall in income. But then eventually, when people have used up those savings, they'll also be forced to move. So what we can see here is actually a really, really complicated relationship between different kinds of climate-linked events on the one hand, different levels of wealth and savings on the other. And I would say, given that those different kinds of climate-linked hazards cause such different kinds of human movement, that it would really be a case of perhaps looking at an individual event, an individual location, an individual drought, for example, and exploring who within that sort of narrower location or particular time frame was forced to move, and what we could say about their their individual circumstances, including their level of income. So yeah, I think that's really interesting, and it's really important thing to consider. I'm not sure that we can draw a kind of general global conclusion from the data at the moment, though.
Thank you, Alex. There's also a question around what programs currently exist in richer countries to help people in the global south move when they have to or choose to.
Right. So I think there are two ways that these programs exist at the moment, and one of them is countries, sort of better off countries, richer countries, offering some kind of legal status or some kind of migratory route for people from poorer countries to move to those other countries, right? And those kind of programs, I have to say, are few and far between. There are really not many countries at all from the global north that have a specific program that allows people from poorer countries who are impacted by climate change to move to those countries in the global north. That's very, very rare. The only example really that I can think of is New Zealand. And there was some talk about a year ago of creating a particular kind, a special kind of visa for people who've been from Pacific Islands, who've been particularly impacted by climate change, and that this visa would entitle them to some kind of residency in New Zealand. In the end, for all kinds of political reasons, that didn't go ahead. However, there are visas that people from Pacific Islands can get to go to both Australia and New Zealand. However, it's worth saying that those visa schemes have not been created necessarily with climate change in mind. It's certainly true that many people who are facing sea level rise or the impacts of sea level rise in the Pacific are taking up the opportunity to move to New Zealand on those visas. But it's not like the government of New Zealand ever went, we should do this because of the impacts of climate change in the Pacific. So what you see is visa programs where they do exist usually don't make a kind of special reference to climate change. They haven't usually been created with climate-linked migration in the forefront of their mind. But I think the answer in general is that when it comes to offering residency or citizenship to people from the global south, to countries in the global north, as a result of climate change, that's something that isn't really formally happening at the moment at all. I think the other way that countries in sort of more developed countries, richer countries are doing things is very often through their aid budget. So rather than offering residency or citizenship, what they're doing is they're looking at the situation in a country where they are a major donor of international aid. And some countries are beginning to think about how they deploy that aid and development spending to make people more resilient to climate change. And that's one of the things that we are going to be exploring when we look at policy responses in session 7. Because that response even is slightly controversial as well, because in a lot of cases, what governments are trying to do is deploy their aid and development spending in order to prevent people from moving. They're trying to build climate change resilience, which of course is good, but they're trying to do it very deliberately to stop people leaving. So I think that raises some important issues about how and why richer countries might deploy aid spending and to what ends, and we'll be looking critically. We'll be trying to assess those later on in the course in session 7.
Okay, and one of the participants was also wondering which reliable sources of statistics around climate change and migration you would recommend.
Okay, so I think the short answer to this is that the best place to look for data on this is the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, the IDMC. And they compile every year they compile data on how many people have been displaced by different kinds of disasters across the world. And you can go and look at that data for free. What it does is show you who got displaced, how many people, by which kind of event and in which country. Now, what that's telling us about is people who are displaced by disasters. It's not really telling us about people who were displaced by climate change. Now, that raises one of the kind of most difficult and vexing questions of this whole issue, and it's something that we'll be exploring as the course goes along, is like, how do we get to grips with the really complicated relationship between climate change and then attributing and then different disasters? How can we attribute particular disasters to climate change? And then secondly, how do we understand the really complicated relationship between those disasters and people moving? Because as we've seen, there are all of these other factors also that determine whether someone ends up being displaced or not, such as, you know, the wealth of their country, such as their own income, right? And because of this really complicated web of causes and effects that goes between the warming of the planet and at the other end, the movement of people, because that kind of chain is so complicated, it actually makes it very difficult to produce sort of reliable statistics on the number of people who've been forced to move because of climate change. Having said that, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center annual statistics on displacement are probably the figures to go to, the figures to use if you are looking for something. Okay,
I think we have maybe time for just one or two more.
Okay, well, let's do one more question, and then I'll wrap up. And questions that we haven't had a chance to address here, I can look at in the chat, and we could also address on the Facebook group as well. So let's do one more, and then
so to wrap up, one question really, following up on the 4 testimonies that you shared. I mean, those are testimonies of people whose lives have been, seriously damaged, suffered major, often traumatic losses. A participant asking who should be held to account for this, who should pay, who should take responsibility.
Yeah, well, that's a massive question, and I think, I can offer my opinion. But I also think that this is one of the things that I'm hoping over the year that you as the course participants will begin to form your own opinions on. Now, I will offer up my view here, but I should caveat it by saying that what I hope will happen over the year is that as you begin to interact with these issues, you begin to form your own opinions as well. Now, however, I don't want to pretend that don't have a view myself. My take on it really is that the responsibility for this lies primarily with the nations that have benefited from causing the problem. I think that's, I think that's also not particularly a controversial opinion. If you look at how the negotiations at the UN take place, when countries meet to try and work out how to deal more generally with climate change, there is an acceptance that wealthier countries that have historically emitted more carbon dioxide, that are therefore more responsible for causing the warming of the planet, should be paying more money towards solving it. Interestingly, it's also those countries that very often are reluctant reluctant to accept migrants and refugees into their country. So I think that raises another question about not just about responsibility for climate change, but also about responsibility more broadly for refugees and migrants and providing them with what they need when they've been forced to move. So that's my view. I'm hoping that over the course of the year, you will be forming your own opinions too. So I think what we should do is wrap up the session there. I will just say a couple of things before we sign off. The first one is, do keep an eye on your inboxes, because in the next few days or very early next week, I will be sending round the task to do, and with it some further reading for you to look at, which means that you will have something that enables you to explore this issue on your own in a bit more depth. Again, keep an eye out on your inboxes for the email, which will be coming later in the month as well, which will be everything that you need in order to take part in the next session, which will be in March. So in between now and then, I will see you on the discussion forums. If you've got questions that are about the content of the course that you'd like to discuss, please do use the Facebook group so that we can all benefit from seeing that conversation. If you've got individual questions about participation in the course, then please do just email me. So finally, I'd like to thank you all for coming to this session. I'd like to thank you all for signing up for the course, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more from you throughout the year.